Think you know the Ford F-150? Well, think again. Today, we're exposing 101 myths and lies about America's most famous truck. And trust me, you won't believe number 27. Myth number 1. The Ford F-150 was the first pickup truck ever made. In fact, Ford had earlier trucks before the F-Series began. Myth number 2. The Ford F-150 has always been the most fuel-efficient truck. In fact, it was often criticized for heavy gas consumption. Myth number 3. Every Ford F-150 is made of steel. In fact, modern versions use military-grade aluminum for the body. Myth number 4. The F-150 was invented in the 2000s. In fact, it dates back to 1948 as part of the original F-Series. Myth number 5. The F-150 is only sold in America. In fact, it has been exported and sold worldwide in several markets. Myth number 6. The F-150 has always used V8 engines. In fact, many modern models use EcoBoost V6 engines. Myth number 7. The F-150 was designed only for farmers. In fact, it was made for both work and personal use. Myth number 8. All F-150s have automatic transmissions. In fact, early models used manual gearboxes. Myth number 9. The F-150 has always dominated sales. In fact, Chevy and Dodge had years of strong competition. Myth number 10. The F-150 is completely bulletproof. In fact, its aluminum panels can dent more easily than steel. Myth number 11. The F-150 is the smallest in the F-Series. In fact, it sits between the Ranger and the Super Duty lineup. Myth number 12. The F-150 was born electric. In fact, the Lightning EV only debuted in 2021. Myth number 13. Every F-150 has four-wheel drive. In fact, many base trims are rear-wheel drive only. Myth number 14. The F-150 is a luxury SUV. In fact, it is a pickup truck, though high trims add luxury features. Myth number 15. The F-150 has always been the cheapest Ford vehicle. In fact, smaller cars were always less expensive. Myth number 16. The F-150 is indestructible. In fact, it has had recalls and issues throughout its history. Myth number 17. All F-150s are built in one factory. In fact, Ford assembles them in multiple U.S. plants. Myth number 18. The F-150 has only been gas-powered. In fact, hybrid and electric versions now exist. Myth number 19. The F-150 has always had an aggressive look. In fact, early models had simple rounded designs. Myth number 20. The F-150 is a truck made only for men. In fact, many women own and drive them daily. Myth number 21. The Ford F-150 has always been available as a crew cab. In fact, early models only came in regular and extended cabs. Myth number 22. The F-150 has always been America's favorite truck. In fact, it took years before it became the best seller. Myth number 23. Every F-150 is built with luxury in mind. In fact, most trims are designed as work trucks. Myth number 24. The F-150 has never been involved in racing. In fact, special editions like the SVT Lightning were made for performance. Myth number 25. The F-150 has always been automatic. In fact, manual transmissions were common in its early decades. Myth number 26. The F-150 has always been safe. In fact, early safety ratings were poor compared to modern trucks. Myth number 27. Every F-150 has leather seats. In fact, base trims come with simple cloth interiors. Myth number 28. The F-150 is only good for hauling light loads. In fact, it can tow trailers weighing over 13,000 pounds. Myth number 29. The F-150 has always been hybrid. In fact, the Power Boost hybrid only came out in 2021. Myth number 30. The F-150 has never been customized. In fact, aftermarket culture for lifted and modified F-150s is massive. Myth number 31. The F-150 has always been cheap to maintain. In fact, modern versions can be very expensive to repair. Myth number 32. The F-150 has always been electric-ready. In fact, Ford had to redesign its platform to handle EV technology. Myth number 33. The F-150 has always been quiet. In fact, older V8 South were famously loud and raw. Myth number 34. The F-150 is only used in the countryside. In fact, it is one of the most popular city trucks. Myth number 35. Every F-150 has touchscreen technology. In fact, early models had only basic knobs and dials. Myth number 36. The F-150 has never been used by the military. In fact, modified versions have been deployed in special operations. Myth number 37. The F-150 has always been fuel efficient. In fact, older V8 South often guzzled gasoline at alarming rates. Myth number 38. The F-150 has always been lightweight. In fact, early steel-bodied trucks were very heavy. Myth number 39. The F-150 has never won awards. In fact, it has received Motor Trend's Truck of the Year multiple times. Myth number 40. The F-150 is only for Americans. In fact, international fans and collectors value it highly. Myth number 41. The F-150 has always been for doors. In fact, early models had only 2-door cabs. Myth number 42. The F-150 was never used for police duty. In fact, some departments modified them as patrol vehicles. Myth number 43. Every F-150 has air conditioning. In fact, older models came with only basic ventilation. Myth number 44. The F-150 has always been luxurious. In fact, for decades it was a simple work truck. Myth number 45. The F-150 has only been built in Detroit. In fact, it has been assembled in several US states. Myth number 46. The F-150 never had a diesel option. In fact, certain generations offered power-stroke diesels. Myth number 47. The F-150 has always been the heaviest-duty Ford truck. In fact, heavier F-250 and F-350 models exist. Myth number 48. Every F-150 comes with the same engine. In fact, dozens of engine choices have been offered over time. Myth number 49. The F-150 has never been recalled. In fact, multiple recalls have been issued across generations. Myth number 50. The F-150 has always had modern safety features. In fact, airbags and ABS came much later. Myth number 51. The F-150 has always had the same body shape. In fact, its design has changed drastically through decades. Myth number 52. The F-150 was never a family vehicle. In fact, many families use it daily for commuting. Myth number 53. Every F-150 has a large touchscreen. In fact, many base trims still have small or no screens. Myth number 54. The F-150 has only been used for work. In fact, many are modified for off-road adventures. Myth number 55. The F-150 has never been sporty. In fact, the Raptor is one of the most famous performance trucks. Myth number 56. Every F-150 has a sunroof. In fact, most trims come without one. Myth number 57. The F-150 has never changed size. In fact, it has grown larger and wider over decades. Myth number 58. Every F-150 is painted white. In fact, it comes in dozens of colors and custom finishes. Myth number 59. The F-150 has always been cheap to buy. In fact, high trims can cost over $80,000. Myth number 60. The F-150 is only for hauling. In fact, it is also popular for camping, road trips, and outdoor lifestyle. Myth number 61. The F-150 has always had power windows. In fact, older models required manual cranks. Myth number 62. Every F-150 is built with luxury materials. In fact, base trims use simple plastic interiors. Myth number 63. The F-150 has always been a lightweight truck. In fact, some models weigh over 5,000 pounds. Myth number 64. Every F-150 has leather steering wheels. In fact, many trims come with basic rubber grips. Myth number 65. The F-150 has never changed wheel size. In fact, modern versions have much larger wheels than older models. Myth number 66. The F-150 has always had GPS navigation. In fact, early models relied only on paper maps. Myth number 67. Every F-150 has chrome bumpers. In fact, many trims feature painted or black bumpers. Myth number 68. The F-150 has always had automatic headlights. In fact, drivers once had to switch them on manually. Myth number 69. Every F-150 has cruise control. In fact, it was not available on older models. Myth number 70. The F-150 has always had airbags. In fact, airbags were only added in the 1990s. Myth number 71. The F-150 has always had touchscreens. In fact, older generations had only radios and cassette players. Myth number 72. The F-150 has always had backup cameras. In fact, they were introduced only in recent years. Myth number 73. Every F-150 has a bed liner. In fact, many trucks came with bare metal beds. Myth number 74. The F-150 has always had towing mirrors. In fact, older models had only small side mirrors. Myth number 75. The F-150 has always had heated seats. In fact, many trims still come without them. Myth number 76. Every F-150 has LED headlights. In fact, halogen bulbs were standard for decades. Myth number 77. The F-150 has always had alloy wheels. In fact, steel wheels were common for years. Myth number 78. Every F-150 has a luxury stereo. In fact, many models shipped with basic AM, FM radios. Myth number 79. The F-150 has always been silent inside. In fact, cabin noise was very high in older trucks. Myth number 80. The F-150 has always been fuel efficient. In fact, earlier V8 South were notorious gas guzzlers. Myth number 81. The F-150 has always had keyless entry. In fact, older models required traditional metal keys. Myth number 82. Every F-150 has automatic climate control. In fact, many trims still use manual dials. Myth number 83. The F-150 has always had luxury interiors. In fact, most were built for durability, not comfort. Myth number 84. The F-150 has only ever been a gas truck. In fact, hybrid and electric models now exist. Myth number 85. Every F-150 has power seats. In fact, many trims come with simple manual seat adjustments. Myth number 86. The F-150 has always had parking sensors. In fact, early generations had none. Myth number 87. Every F-150 has automatic transmissions. In fact, manuals were common until the 1980s. Myth number 88. The F-150 has always had anti-lock brakes. In fact, ABS was added much later. Myth number 89. Every F-150 has powered tailgates. In fact, most trucks still use manual tailgates. Myth number 90. The F-150 has always had high towing capacity. In fact, early versions could tow far less than today. Myth number 91. Every F-150 comes with leather seats. In fact, cloth and vinyl are standard on base trims. Myth number 92. The F-150 has always been aerodynamic. In fact, earlier boxy designs created a lot of drag. Myth number 93. Every F-150 has a digital dashboard. In fact, most older ones had only analog gauges. Myth number 94. The F-150 has always been built with aluminum. In fact, steel was the standard for decades. Myth number 95. Every F-150 comes with four-wheel drive. In fact, many trims are rear-wheel drive only. Myth number 96. The F-150 has always been a global model. In fact, for many years it was sold only in North America. Myth number 97. Every F-150 has advanced driver assistance. In fact, these features appeared only recently. Myth number 98. The F-150 has always been safe in rollovers. In fact, older models had poor rollover resistance. Myth number 99. Every F-150 has turbo engines. In fact, naturally aspirated V8 South were dominant for decades. Myth number 100. The F-150 has always had disc brakes on all wheels. In fact, many older versions had drum brakes. Myth number 101. The F-150 has always been seen as just a work tool. In fact, it became a cultural icon in America. If these myths shocked you, smash that like button and subscribe for more jaw-dropping automotive facts. And hey, drop a comment with which myth blew your mind the most. See you in the next video.